treating drug dealers, not people selling drugs to kids, but people selling drugs to one another. Why does it make sense to treat those people the same as a rapist or a murderer? When what they're effectively
Mm,
doing is no different than a person selling cigarettes or alcohol or guns or other things that could be problematic. Treat
right.
it like a white collar offense. Okay, punish them for violating the law, but don't lock them away for 10, 20, 30 years or a life sentence. I mean, these are all just basic pragmatic approaches, many of which were already proving effective in other countries around the world.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Love, Loss, and Hallucinations. I am your host, Scott Shoemaker, and this is a podcast where we start with those three themes, love, loss, and hallucinations, and kind of see where the conversation takes us. And before we get started, just a quick note that we are not doctors, and this is not medical advice. We are no way encouraging anyone to partake in any illegal activities. This podcast is for informational purposes only. So hopefully you've all noted that, and let's get into it. My guest today is Ethan Nadelmann. Ethan taught about drugs and drug policy at Princeton back in the day, and then he went on to found the Drug Policy Alliance, and he has played a leading role in legalizing marijuana and challenging drug prohibition. He was described by Rolling Stone magazine as, quote, the real drug czar, unquote. He is an author, a speaker, the host of the Psychoactive podcast, currently working on another book, this is what I hear, and one of the leading voices in drug policy reform and harm reduction. Welcome to the show, Ethan.
Well, thanks, Scott. It's good to be on, and it was nice to meet you a few weeks ago in person, out in the Valley. So, I'm happy to do this.
Yeah, we just met recently, like 2 weeks ago, at another recent podcast guest, Tiffany Shalane, and her husband, Ken, hosted a Shabbat dinner, and Ethan was there, and I was like, well, yeah, I got to have you on my show. So he's kind enough to grace us with his presence and knowledge and wisdom. So I'm excited to get into it today with someone who has such a background and all of this. So I guess, to get started, like, I don't know if love for this work, this policy reform sort of thing is the right word. Maybe passion for it is a better word. Um,
Yeah.
your passion for changing the policy approaching around the war on drugs. And like, just to lay it out there, like back in the day, if like Nancy Reagan was like, just say no, like Ethan was the other side of that. And not just say yes. That's not quite right. But
Well, actually,
he
Scott,
was,
the way I would put
yeah.
it is what we were also saying, just say no, but we were saying just say no, KNOW, right?
ANOW. Yeah. Yeah.
In other words, let's be smart about this, right? That
Mm,
there's never been a drug-free society. There's never going to be a drug-free society, and therefore the real challenge is how do we learn how to live with drugs in a way that
hmm
causes the least possible harm, and in some cases the greatest possible benefit. It's about achieving that balance, right? And
Right. And I'm wondering, as you were like getting into this, you studied like international drug policy and that sort of thing in college. And was there a moment where you were like, wow, we're just approaching this all wrong, and it is more about the no and approaching it with an education and understanding of what's the underlying causes, that sort of thing?
well, I'd say there were stages of it, Scott. I mean, the first one was,
Mm,
starting off college. I started college at McGill University in Montreal, and that's where I first started getting high. Actually, mostly on hash, not on marijuana. And pretty early on, you're always, God, this is fun. This is nice. I'm still doing well in school. Most of my friends are handling this well, although a few did not handle it so well. And why the hell can I get arrested for this stuff or stopped at the border? When meanwhile, I like alcohol too, but alcohol is clearly more problematic. And yet, so that just kind of resonated with me. And then, when I was, graduate, I mean, obviously experience with doing mushrooms, in the early
hmm
80s, I could understand maybe why we didn't want to sell this stuff over the counter. On the other hand, those were really positive experiences oftentimes. I mean, some were just fun, but
Hmm.
others were really meaningful in a kind of spiritual or intellectual kind of way. And then when I started to write my dissertation, which initially was on the internationalization of drug enforcement, I think I may have told you when we met, that resulted in my getting a security clearance and working in the State Department Narcotics Bureau and interviewing US DEA and foreign drug enforcement agents all in 19 different
Wow.
countries around the world and writing a classified report on drug-related money laundering and writing a book called Cops Across Borders and co-authoring another one called Policing the Globe, all about the internationalization of crime and law enforcement, in which I was not
Hmm.
making the case really for reform. But while I was doing that, I was reading more deeply about the history of drugs and about other drugs. And, I think probably what helped move me to a broader perspective was learning about heroin. It
Mm.
was realizing, and the opioids more generally, it was realizing that, you know, that, for example, in Britain from the 1920s through the 60s, 70s, there were hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people who were prescribed pharmaceutical heroin by their doctors.
Wow.
And these were people who had a job and a family and drove a car and had children and all this kind of stuff. And I said, really? Is that possible? And then I was reading about the use of opium and laudanum and opiate derivatives in America. And
Hmm.
you know, in the late 19th and early 20th century, when most of the consumers were middle-aged white women, and the vast
Right.
majority, I mean, some of them, like Eugene O'Neill's mother, right, got addicted to the stuff. But for many, it was just something you use for aches and pains and to sleep, or even in many countries, they would just take a tiny little bit when a baby was teething and just put a tiny bit on their tongue to kind of calm them. I mean, it was kind of the universal pain medication for thousands of years, right? And so I began to really, and then I learned that actually, if if you think about various drugs, if you smoke cigarettes regularly into your
Mm.
40s, 50s, 60s, there's a very good chance it's going to give you lung cancer, heart disease, something like that. If you drink too
Yeah.
much alcohol, there's a very good chance you're going to land up with problems with both cardiovascular and cirrhosis, what have you. If you like cocaine, snorting cocaine too much, that's going to mess with you. I mean, that's a rough drug. Any of the stimulant drugs, they can be good if used on occasion or in short term, but if you get into them too much, if you like them too much, they will hurt you. The
Hmm.
opioids, what I realized was that if people who had a clean supply of heroin, pharmaceutical grade heroin, or morphine or some other strong opioid, if you were taking that on a regular basis and not playing around with the dose, you could live to be 90 years old. The opioids don't destroy the internal organs, that in
Wow.
fact, if you ask a doctor, what is the worst effect on my body of taking heroin or other opioids or morphine or whatever into my body, I don't know, he'll say the worst effect, truthfully, is constipation. And you may be a little less sensitive to emotional, physical pain, but basically it's not going to do to your body with alcohol or smoking or other things. So I think that opened me up to realizing that, my God, how many Americans know what I just told you, right? I mean, the vast majority don't, and yet so therefore
Not
we have
many then, not many now.
not
Yeah.
many now, and therefore we have policies that are based in ignorance and not based in science. So that kinda hit me, and then
Mm.
I started looking at, well, we have this war on drugs that got launched in the 19 I mean, Nixon had launched one in the early '70s, then it kinda quieted down during the Jimmy Carter days, and then Ronald Reagan and George Bush, together with it was bipartisan, a Democratic Congress, and not just white leaders, but
Hmm.
black leaders like Jesse Jackson and a Harlan congressman named Charlie Rangel. They were gung ho for the drug war. And you start looking at how much it's costing and how much is being put into this, and yet how remarkably ineffective it is. And just
Yeah.
the logical part of my brain, the brain that was becoming a academic and a professor, the one that believed in evidence and honesty, was saying, this is ridiculous. This is just bullshit. And so I'd say, even within a few years, I was writing some essays saying, no. I mean, I don't know that legalizing all drugs is the right idea, the way some of the libertarians like William Buckley or Milton Friedman were saying that.
Hmm. Hmm.
But clearly, the war on drugs is not just not working, it's doing more harm than good. And there got to be better ways of dealing with this.
Right. Right. And yeah, I mean, and just to like share like the whole war on drug in the 80s and your brain on a frying pan and
Right.
all of that. Like it definitely did a good job on me as a teenager. Like I was like, I'm not touching that stuff. I'm like, and it wasn't until 36 when I finally like tried a psychoactive drug, and did ayahuasca. So, I was pretty, and there's some drinking in there a little bit, but it
Yeah.
was just like nothing. I'm not touching any of that. So yeah, the propaganda worked for sure in
Yeah.
that respect.
Yeah.
But
Although, it's interesting because some of your listeners may remember the DARE programs where police officers
hmm
would go into schools and
yeah,
and
I
and
I attended one of those. Yep.
yeah, and I remember my daughter going being one of them, and I remember one time going in on Parents' Day, and I went up to the DARE officer, and I said, "Look, you seem like a nice guy, but my job is to get you the hell out of this school because I don't think you are the right people." I mean, the notion of I would be fine with having cops come into school to teach about public, safety, about weapons,
hmm
about,
hmm
real crime. But the notion of cops coming in to talk about drugs when many of them had never used drugs, so they didn't even know what they were talking about. And if they had used
Right.
drugs, they couldn't talk about it because that would not be permitted. And so you basically, I mean, it's like having sex education taught by people who never had sex, right? It's like having, French taught by somebody who'd never been to France. It was just ridiculous, like, yeah, teach me
hmm
pottery, and you've never done pottery. I mean, just ludicrous. And so, my view was when it came to kids, we really needed more of a sex education model, which
mm,
is, to discourage young people from getting into it too young, but just to assume that at some point they will. And that therefore you want to make sure that when they do it, the bottom line is not did you or didn't you? The bottom line is, are you going to come home safely at the end of the night and go to
right.
make me healthy grandkids? And then
Yeah.
it turned out those DARE programs, they actually kind of scared kids away in the first few years. But as the kids then became adolescents, they were almost either as likely or more likely to use drugs as opposed to the kids who never were in a DARE program. So, lying to kids can sometimes be a good deterrent in the short term, but it
hmm
oftentimes flips over and proves to be counterproductive over the long term. I'm sorry, in the short term,
Yeah.
but in the long term. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I would agree with that because like I said, I didn't try anything till 36. And honestly, like intentional, like purposeful use of like certainly mushrooms or ayahuasca, like I wish I had started that sooner at this point, once a year or something like that. Oh, missed out on some extra wisdom there, I feel.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it's an interesting question because, in the psychedelics world right now, people in that world are oftentimes criticized by people dealing with other psychoactive drugs for being what
Mm,
they call psychedelic exceptionalists, right? They only care about
hmm
psychedelics, they don't care about anything else. And when I talk to those groups, they're expecting me to harangue them or lecture them about this is obnoxious and elitist and arrogant. And actually, what I start off by saying is, let me tell you something. I am a psychedelic exceptionalist. I am, for that matter, a
hmm
marijuana and psychedelic exceptionalist, right? And why? Because, first of all, in my personal life, those drugs have been overwhelmingly positive things in my life. I mean, I've been,
hmm
consuming marijuana on occasional basis, never really a daily basis, for 50 years now. And psychedelics have been something I've done on occasion since I was in my 20s. So yes, I think, and so the benefit cost ratio in my life is enormous. And I've
hmm
tried many of the other illicit drugs, but none of them can compare in that respect. Although I must say, when you're in profound pain in a hospital, the opioids are magical. There's a reason why, they're not going to disappear. Why
Yeah.
we need those things. But at the same time, I said, you know, there's a principle here, which is that people don't deserve to be punished for what we put in our bodies if we don't hurt anybody else, right? That's a
That's the key,
core
right? If we're not
principle.
hurting anybody else.
You're not
Yep.
hurting anybody else. And so what that means to me is that, I mean, take an example. God forbid you're a parent with two kids who are addicts, and one is addicted to booze and the other one is addicted to heroin. Now, the
hmm
doctor will tell you that actually the alcohol is going to do more damage to their body than is the heroin if they have a reliable, clean source, right? The real problem with most
Yeah.
heroin is it's from the street and it's adulterated and cut, what have you, right? But think about it. That parent may have two kids struggling with this, and they may both be going to 12-step programs at various points or other programs, but the kid who's addicted to alcohol, he doesn't get arrested or go to jail unless he gets behind the wheel of a car driving
Right.
when he's drunk or hurts somebody. The person who's using heroin, they can be arrested just for sitting in their own bedroom and taking heroin without doing any harm to anybody else. It just doesn't make any sense. If you want to provide treatment, you want it to be on an equal basis, not where one is done through the criminal justice system, the other one is not. So I think there's a principle here, and it also translates into good public policy, which is to
Mm.
say that when we're dealing with these other really problematic drugs, whether it's fentanyl or heroin or cocaine or crack or whatever it might, the synthetics, that nobody gets punished simply for consuming it. If
Mm.
you land up hurting somebody else, if you're stealing to support your habit, if you're being violent with somebody, if you're losing control, then you have to be held responsible. My
Mhm.
core principles are freedom, responsibility, and compassion. The freedom that I am
Mm.
sovereign of my own mind and body, and what I put in here is nobody's business. Secondly, responsibility. I don't get to say, hey, don't hold me responsible. I'm an addict, therefore I can't be held responsible. On some level, yes, people are addicted, but people need in any civilized society to be held responsible for their actions. And maybe a judge will take into account their addiction and how he handles them, but you need responsibility. And then thirdly, compassion. Let's be
Mm.
compassionate. I am lucky. I am wired in such a way that I have a non or even anti-addictive personality. Other people kind of are born or wired or develop an addiction that is really incredibly difficult and horrible and causes pain to them and their families and what have you, right? And so let's be compassionate. Let's hold people responsible, but at the same time, be compassionate in dealing with that.
Yeah, so you're coming at kind of this whole thing from not a "you did bad, we gotta put you in jail," but from a place of compassion and harm reduction.
That's right, but it's responsibilities mixed into that, which is I don't think
Yeah, yeah.
people can just say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I hit that old lady over the head to steal her, pocketbook. It's because no. I mean, people
Yeah,
need,
that is not
you know,
cool.
no,
Yeah.
no. And so, maybe a judge will say, "Okay, I'm going to give you a few chances to kind of, try to get your stuff together. But I am telling you, if you hurt somebody else again, you are going to be treated just like a non-addict. You are going to be
Mhm.
punished for that, right?" So
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
think about it, Scott, it's really about, the work I did when I shifted from being an academic who was writing about this stuff to being an activist and creating the Drug Policy Alliance, it was really about, you know, um, just trying to advance more, science-based, rational,
Mm.
human rights-based policies. In fact, even though I'm based in New York, my organization had the largest number of offices in California. At one point, we had offices in San Francisco, Oakland, Sacramento, and LA. And, I was the one who, kind of put together in some respect the first medical marijuana initiative in California, Prop 215, which had been drafted by
Yep,
local
yep.
activists, but I was the person who brought together the funding and hired the campaign manager. Um, and my career took me right up till 2016, where we were the ones who led the marijuana legalization initiative in 2016, which was a crazy, crazy thing. But in between that, we were doing things like legalizing needle exchange programs to reduce
Mm.
HIV/AIDS. We were making
Mhm.
naloxone, the antidote for an overdose, available, over the counter in order to deal with the overdose epidemic. We were the ones saying that when people got arrested for drug possession, that they could not be sent to prison at first. They had to be
Mm.
offered treatment. There was a initiative, Proposition 36, the treatment instead of incarceration initiative in California back in 2000, that at that time was the most significant sentencing reform law in America since the repeal of alcohol prohibition. Right. And we
Wow.
worked on a whole host of other issues about saying, no, you can't just drug test people without cause. No, you're not going to be forcing our kids in schools to be handing over their urine to the authorities, right? No, you're not, civil asset forfeiture. No, the cops don't get to seize your property just based upon suspicion and keep it for their own departments, right? No, that's not what this country's meant to be about. And so,
No.
it was that diversity of issues saying, let's bring, common sense, science, human rights,
Mhm.
compassion, harm reduction to bear on all this.
Yeah. And so with that, all of that and this different approach to drugs in general, like what is your like, how do you see that as a benefit to society, I guess? Because I'm sure people ask you that all the time, especially those who are like, oh my God, drug people are going to kill me, you know?
Well, I think, in quite a number of ways. I mean, the first one is in just promoting more rational policies.
Mm, hmm.
The evidence on needle exchange programs and allowing people to obtain a sterile syringe in a pharmacy without a prescription, the evidence was obvious, right? That
Mm,
doing that reduced the spread of HIV/AIDS and other infectious diseases without increasing drug use. It's why virtually every European country and Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and even countries in the developing world all were implementing these programs, whereas in America, our kind of craziness,
hmm.
the harsh part of our society, the moralizing, the same reasons that why we were one of the only countries in the Western world to do alcohol prohibition, right? This notion that you have to put your morals into criminal laws and then just batter people in the head
Yeah.
and lock them up, right? I mean, it was just obvious. Providing access to methadone maintenance programs for people who wanted to stop being a street heroin addict. The science, National Academy of Sciences, National Health, World Health Organization all said, yes, that's the thing to do, but state and local governments were not doing it. Medical marijuana, right? Oh, I mean, marijuana has been used medicinally for thousands of years. It was in the American Pharmacopoeia until 1937. In 1988, the DEA's own administrative law judge said this may well be the safest therapeutic substance used by humankind today. So
Yeah.
medical marijuana, people get derived an obvious benefit. People say, oh, come on, that's bullshit, just smoking your medicine. But in fact, when taking a puff off a joint or a vaporizer, in fact, instantly reduces nausea or improves
Mm,
appetite or stops the tremors that you may have from Parkinson's or MS or whatever, then of course do it, right? If you think about marijuana legalization, right? I mean, we're now in this long process of doing something we've never done historically, which is to take a underground market worth many tens of billions of dollars that was incredibly dynamic and shifting it into the legal regulated world, right? And California's had
yeah.
a particularly difficult time with this because California had far and away the most embedded and most diverse and most vibrant illicit market in all of America, right? But
Yeah.
if
They
you
didn't want that to change the illicit market.
no, right, and you look around at other states, what you're seeing is that over time, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of consumers shift from the illegal market to the legal market, right? So it was
Hmm.
just sensible, treating drug dealers, not people selling drugs to kids, but people selling drugs to one another. Why does it make sense to treat those people the same as a rapist or a murderer? When what they're effectively
Mm,
doing is no different than a person selling cigarettes or alcohol or guns or other things that could be problematic.
right.
Treat it like a white collar offense. Okay, punish them for violating the law, but don't lock them away for 10, 20, 30 years or a life sentence. I mean, these are all just basic pragmatic approaches, many of which were already proving effective in other countries around the world, but where we
Right.
were stuck in America and not doing it.
Right. And it seems like these preventative measures, whether it's needle exchange or, harm reduction or that sort of thing, is actually more cost effective if you're looking at an economic cost to society than putting people away in jail and having to feed them and lock them, and feeding the whole prison industrial complex, right?
I mean, hands down, you look there's something that has now exists in, uh, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 other countries in Europe, even there's one or two in Latin America, Australia, Canada, what have you. And they're called safe injection sites, or now they're called overdose
Mm,
prevention centers. And San Francisco actually has had one that's operated quasi underground, like tolerated by the authorities. And
hmm.
and 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 now Minnesota and Rhode Island have passed laws to set them up, and New York City actually has one ongoing. But the federal government has always been opposed, even under Democrats, right?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
if you look at those things, people go, it's basically those things are basically like a needle exchange program with a back room where there's a nurse, so that people who are using drugs, especially injecting, sometimes smoking, instead of them doing it on the streets or doing them at home where they may
Mm,
overdose and die alone, they do them at the site. And there are now hundreds of thousands of people who have been through these things around the world. And as so far as I know, there's never been a fatality. And there have been tens of
Wow.
thousands of overdose reversals, right? Now, these things also provide there may be a washing machine, a pot of coffee, access to some
Mm,
laptops. There's some people who can help you. If you think you want to stop using drugs, there are people who can recommend different treatment programs to go to, recommend a healthcare place to go to look at your health, your abscesses, your wounds, what have you. These things land up saving immense amount of money in terms of reduced criminal justice and emergency room and other health costs, right? So they're
mm,
a net
yeah.
financial benefit to the taxpayer. I'll tell you, so let me tell you
Right.
one other
Mm,
interesting thing. There's a form of treatment called contingency management, and there's been these studies done at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere. And it's basically this. Take Imagine you take 100 um, people involved in drug use or drug sale or whatever at a lower level, right? And one group, you say to them, okay, I'm going to give you a chance here. You got to you got to be drug free, hand in your urine to me regularly. You got to be showing up, you da 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 da. And if you do that, right, we'll eventually dismiss the charges or whatever. But if you screw up,
hmm
right, we're going to lock you up. We're going to punish you. And then
Yeah.
take the other group, the other half of the group, same background, same offenses, same, profile, right? Drug use, drug deal, whatever. And in them, you say to them, okay, we want you to be drug free, dirty, same expectations. But you know what? We're going to pay you to be good. We're going to give you a little money, a couple bucks every time you bring us your clean urine. We're going to give you a couple every time when you're showing. We're going to reward you for being a good person, right?
Yeah.
Now, which of those two options do you think saves the taxpayer more money? The one that, says, do this and we'll lock you up if you fail, or the one that pays people to be good? And the one that
Well,
pays people to
go
be
ahead.
good is just dramatically cheaper because
hmm
when you throw people into jail, it costs taxpayers a fortune. It turns out
Yep.
when you pay people to be good, they're much more likely to succeed. Now, people respond to
hmm
that. Oh, why the hell don't you pay me to stop not use drugs, right? People go, how can you pay people to be good? Well, I mean, you're supposed to. But in fact, if you're looking at a rational cost benefit basis, the
hmm
taxpayer and the citizen who doesn't want to waste their money on drug addicts and doesn't want to get mugged or what have you, they're better off with that system that's paying people to do a little. So that's once again, it's a harm reduction approach. And on some level, it's a
Yeah.
common sense approach.
Yeah. Well, and I love just that, as you said, the common sense approach, the rational, combined with like just having compassion and empathy for this human who might be having a hard time and might have become addicted, and basing things around that versus fear, which having listened to you talk on a couple other podcasts, you brought up what I found was fascinating was, speaking of fear, a lot of this policy is based on racism and xenophobia from historically.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the question, as I said about the opiates earlier, so long as, middle-aged white women were the principal consumer,
Mhm,
people didn't talk about criminalization because nobody wanted to put their middle-class white, auntie or grandma behind bars. But when the
mhm,
public perception shifted to Chinese immigrants who were, working, 80, 90 hours a week on the railroads and the mines and factories, and who would go home at the end of the evening and smoke an opium pipe the same way the good white people were having a drink, that's when you got the first criminalization laws and grounded in what would these Chinamen do to our beloved white women, addicting them and turning them into
fear.
sex slaves and all of that.
Yeah,
To some extent, the cocaine laws were about the fear. Cocaine was widely used. Cocaine was in Coca-Cola till 1900. It was in all these other things, and it was not a really major problem when it was perceived as a drug being used by black men in the South, and the fear once again of those men getting a hold of guns and what they would do to our white women. That's when you saw the drug craze. Marijuana,
mm,
to some extent, was about fear of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans who, brought the funny reefer, and once again, that same fear. And Even if you go back to the days of Nixon or what have you, some of it was the fear of the hippies and the hippie culture and all of
Right.
that, right? So it was that kind of fear around ethnicity and xenophobia and race was played a huge role. And then the other factor, of course, is another fear, which is our fear around our kids. It's that we all
Mm,
want to put
mhm.
our baby in a bubble and we're afraid that drugs will pierce that bubble, or even the kind of words that are coming out of my mouth will pierce that bubble. And so we want to protect. And, for any parent, what ultimately matters is your kid. And if that means we're going to lock up a million people who I don't know in order to make it less likely my kid will use or have access to drugs, oh, okay, let's do it. Now, that's not actually rational because in the end, all the locking up we saw did not actually reduce the availability of drugs. But it made you could play on those fears. And one of the things,
Yeah.
there was an element, a reactionary wing to the Republican Party. I remember the first drug czar was a fellow named William Bennett, he was in
Mhm.
Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education. They became the first George Bush's first drug czar. And he and others like him really played on these fears around race in our kids in order to advance a really reactionary type of policy agenda that most middle of the road Americans would not normally support. But when they got scared enough over race and crime and kids, would embrace. And so a lot
Mhm.
of the work of myself and my organization and my allies was really about trying to both talk common sense and then also reach into people's hearts. It was about peeling to
Mm.
people's minds and their hearts, about not just being compassionate, but letting go of the fear enough that they could let the reason in.
I love that. And I mean, along that line about, you know, being in touch with your heart, letting the reason in, I imagine through all your years of this work, you have found love and compassion and witnessed it in some unexpected places. And whether that's courtroom or jail or on the streets. And I'm just wondering if anything comes to mind that,
Well,
uh,
I'll tell you, I mean, you know what, it's funny because as I'm working on my memoir now, and part of making a memoir
mm,
work is writing about these emotional moments and such. And so, I think, I mean, literally the one that's just been on my mind, in the last few days, because I'm writing about 1996. I remember going to visit. There was a cannabis buyers club in San Francisco run by Dennis Perone, who was a
mhm,
former AIDS activist and former marijuana dealer, and he got involved in the medical marijuana issue. And I went to his buyers club, and it was illegal, but he was thinking strategically and politically. And I remember going there. I remember sitting there, got high, we got high, and then I remember going down to the lower floor basement, and there was live music there, and there was a guy and people in the audience smoking joints or using a vaporizer or whatever. And there was a guy sitting in a wheelchair singing his heart out really beautifully. And in the audience were other people in wheelchairs, as well as this guy's 10-year-old
mm,
old daughter, you know?
mm,
And I just thought,
mhm,
wow, this is a compassion club. This is a place of compassion. And there's nothing wrong with a child seeing cannabis being used in a social but also medicinal way. Um, I
mhm,
think about the moments when we were organizing in New York to repeal what were the draconian Rockefeller drug laws, these laws that would lock up people for crazy amounts of years. And and I remember some of my colleagues describing they went to see the Republican head of the Senate, Joe Bruno, who had really been hostile to our agenda. And they brought along a few of the kids whose parents had been locked up for 10 or 20 years on a first time offense. And Bruno came to tears, and here was this hard-hearted Republican, just something happened there, you know? Um,
yeah,
it's also that feeling, I mean look, on some level, I am at heart, a proselytizer, and I can relate to others who've been proselytizers, and, um or I would even call myself a moral entrepreneur. It's a term out of the academic literature, which sometimes is a negative term,
mhm,
you know, but you see when people, um, there's a kind of not just intellectual, but almost physical and spiritual transformation that can sometimes be subtle when people go from clinging on to a fearful drug war
Mm,
approach to
mhm,
embracing another way of looking at this. I mean, I think about some of the people. I remember there were people I used to debate who then eventually came over to our side and how they would talk about their transformation. I'm thinking about
mm,
parents who had kids who were addicted. And, so many of them initially just want to go out and kill the drug dealers and hate drugs. But I look at some of there's an organization called A New Path, headed by some women in California, actually. When they come over to embracing a harm reduction and drug policy reform approach, there's a transformation. It's a kind of breathing and enlightening thing where you become almost a better human being by being able to embrace that side rather than
mm.
the other side.
Yeah, and to kinda live in that more of a gray, like, "This isn't the way it must be," sort of thing. It also makes me think of, Rick Perry,
Yeah.
former governor of Texas, who's now a big proponent of ibogaine and, using that for PTSD and, like, didn't see that coming, but
No, but,
he had the emotional experience, like you're saying, where he was witnessed, I think, a former military, veteran was, like, came and lived with him because he was, like, homeless or something, and then went and did ibogaine, and he personally saw the transformation, so and that's what did it for him.
it did. I mean, I'll tell you, Scott, because I saw him speak twice at the Psychedelic Science Conference, the huge conference
Mm,
in Denver every 2 years that
mhm,
the organization MAPS, Multidisciplinary Associated Psychedelic Studies, puts on, an organization that was founded by Rick Doblin. And, and I remember the conference when he was there 3 years ago. He was the opening speaker. And he gets up in front of, 10,000 people. And he says, I know you're all wondering what I'm doing here. And you probably all think I am some kind of knuckle dragging Neanderthal Republican. And I sort of am. But I met those veterans who have been healed through this medicine. And then I fell in love
mhm,
with Rick Doblin, the head of the founding organization.
yeah,
And here I am. And he then gave a no-note speech for 10, 15 minutes that was informed and passionate. 2 years later, last year, came back to Denver. He spoke again. This time he had done ibogaine, right? And he really committed. And, a few months later,
mhm,
he wrote an article in the Washington Post saying he's committing the rest of his life for this being his number one objective. And he's created an organization to do this.
amazing.
Afterward, and then what was interesting was, on stage that second time, he actually went from talking about ibogaine to talking about how harsh the war on drugs was, and why are we
Wow,
locking up people, not for psychedelics, but for other stuff for so long? Why
yeah,
can't we get a little more and so, I saw, ibogaine, I mean, this was a person who was being, um going through an evolution, I think. I think about back
mhm,
in 99, 2000, there was a libertarian-minded Republican governor of New Mexico, Gary Johnson, who spoke out in favor of legalizing drugs. And I got to him quickly and I say, don't talk about legalizing drugs, talk about legalizing marijuana and harm reduction with the other drugs. And then we opened an office there. We worked with him. The Democrats hated Johnson because he was vetoing more spending bills than every other governor in the history of New Mexico had put together. But you know something? In the end, even as he was vetoing all those other spending bills and signing off on some of our drug reform legislation, he also signed a bill that dramatically increased government spending on drug treatment. Now, here was cut every government spend as much as you can, because I think he'd come to understand. And it's always the issue, with me and libertarians, because my politics are kind of centrist, center left. And I tend to say to libertarians, whether it's Grover Norquist, the famous one in DC, or whether it was Gary Johnson back
mhm,
then, I said, I get your point. Well, we agree fundamentally on the critique of drug prohibition. And we analyze drug prohibition the same way people analyzed alcohol prohibition. It's just not working and doing far more harm than good. But
right,
what I understand is, yes, government needs to be held accountable. But what I, as a kind of political centrist or left of centrist, whatever, believe is that when government can establish that it's spending the taxpayer money is going to not just do some good, but is actually going to save taxpayers money because it's an efficient way to spend our money, then why don't you
mm,
support that? And I think
Yeah.
Gary Johnson in that case came around to it and did support increased funding for treatment. So I think people get transformed. Another meeting we had, we were thinking about trying to find a way to get heroin prescribing going in the US the way they were doing in Europe and Canada.
Mm.
And we did a
Mhm.
meeting in an office, and we had the New Mexico Secretary of Health there, who was a Republican. And we also had one of the active drug users who was regularly using heroin, but was also very articulate and smart. And they landed up, that Secretary of Health and this guy, kind of bonding at this meeting. And it just changed the way that Republican Secretary of Health felt and thought. Here was a human being who he knew
Mm.
was injecting heroin once or twice a day and had been doing so for years, who was highly articulate at this meeting and was funny and humorous. And, that humanization of
Mm.
people, which makes such a
Yep.
difference.
Such a difference. I mean, once you yeah, I mean, it just automatically bridges that divide, especially when you connect with them on some level. And yeah, yeah, it's just that's why we that's what I mean, right now as a society when we feel more disconnected and more apart from each other because of technology, even though it's allowing us to have this lovely conversation across the United States, it's
Right.
like, to have those interpersonal connections is so important on anything before making rash judgments, I feel, you know?
I mean, Scott, I'll tell you another, thinking about, this horrific conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And,
Mhm.
but two little anecdotes there. I remember hearing 15 years ago or whatever, that there were raves where you had Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs and
Mhm.
Palestinians, there. And it wasn't like a love-in, but it was
Yeah.
just a much more the way that MDMA opens up that sense of empathy and understanding. And the other thing that's happened more recently is there have been, most of the kind of the Jewish Arab peace groups in Israel, or in Israel and the West Bank, the occupied territory, a lot of them fell apart after October 7th. But
Yeah.
one of the ones that survived, what they did, they actually went through a guided ayahuasca
Wow.
experience together. They went to Spain and they did it there. And what they were able to do is go to the deepest fears on both
Mm.
sides. I mean, the ways in which, on the one hand, Palestinians have just, they've been oppressed and occupied by Israel and the West Bank, forever. And then in Gaza, I mean, Gaza is more recent, but just the devastation that the Netanyahu government has done there. But meanwhile, on the Israeli Jewish side, there is the trauma of the Holocaust, of the
Mm.
deliberate massive murder of the vast
Yeah.
majority of the Jewish population in Europe, right? And even among the non-European Jews, remember half of Israel is not from Eastern, is not from Europe. The half of
Right.
Israelis are actually descend from the kind of Arab and Muslim world, right? And for many of them, their families had lived in Iraq and Iran and Yemen and other countries for over millennia, sometimes 2 millennia. And suddenly, after the creation of Israel and the decades there, they are all mass expelled. There's pogroms against them; they got to flee. So there's this trauma there, and the ayahuasca, in a guided session, enabled people to go to a really, really deep place and enable them to stick together and to have some sense of compassion, empathy in the midst, you know, of Netanyahu on one side and Hamas and Hezbollah on the other
Yeah.
side.
Yeah.
So there is a power to these things that is really important. Of course, the tragedy is nobody can figure out how to scale this up into a really meaningful way where it's
Yeah.
consequential.
Yeah. I think we're still working on that.
Yeah.
But, speaking of healing, that does bring to mind, like, how do you feel any of these, maybe it's one specific use that comes to mind or experience you had, like, how have they helped you heal on some level? And what did they help heal, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. On my podcast, Psychoactive, I did a little bonus
Mhm.
session where a friend of mine, Giancarlo Canavesio, interviewed me about my various psychedelic experience. So anyone want check out my podcast, Psychoactive, and then listen to that episode where actually we turned it around and somebody interviewed me on it. But what I would say is, I mean, there's numerous instances. I mean, just for
Of
one,
course.
MDMA. I did it for the first time in the early 90s with, my wife at the time, and we were just in a terrible place,
Mm,
and really just on the edge of breaking up, and we had our daughter was, like, 3 at the time,
mm,
and it was transformative in this I mean, we what the next just in terms of kind of reconnecting into our love and understanding. We were going to see our marriage counselor a few days later, and she was just blown away. Now, in the end, we still split up, the following year, but I think we were able to come to a softer landing, and we've been, we've been good co-parents and friends ever since. And I think the MDMA helped in that regard. I think that, I mean, for me, mushrooms has been my go-to among the
uh-huh.
psychedelics, and there, what it's done is it's really enabled me to just dig deeper on all sorts of fronts. Um, there have been there's sometimes with mushrooms, and it's happened with ayahuasca as well. Well, I'll start to focus on somebody. Could be a colleague, a friend, whatever it might be, and I'll start writing um, a letter to them in my head. And then, what's nice about psychedelics as opposed to cannabis is that oftentimes the next day your memory is still really sharp. And so I would then sit down the next day and I'd actually write that letter and send it to somebody, oftentimes expressing appreciation for that. And and it really touched, it enabled me to speak from the heart and find the words to do
Yeah.
that. And I think in my romantic relationships and in my certainly my current one, it's just plain, the levels of kind of intimacy and being in a journey together, just recently where, my partner was going through almost this cathartic sobbing. You come out of just feeling free and light in a way. And in my case, it might be about this kind of intimacy, emotional connection, or I was actually in this case processing, writing my book and trying to go deeper in an emotional way on this stuff. So I think they can be tool sounds like a crude word. So sometimes
Mhm.
I prefer the word fuel, that they are a type of fuel that
Mm,
can really enliven and enhance and deepen parts of ourself that may be buried or stuck or suppressed, in
yeah.
ways that if you don't just run from the next day, if you own it and think about it and, can really, my partner, we turned on the tape recorder, the latter part of our trip just in the background. And then last night I went through
Love that.
the recording and there was really valuable stuff there, really useful, valuable stuff to run with, So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I just wanna reflect, like, the whole about writing a letter to people in your life, the next day. I mean, that just touches me because I was actually recently doing a, solo ceremony, with San Pedro or Wachuma, and that's known as a heart opener, and, you just really get authentic, like, can't get any more real feelings, and I started, like, recording voice memos to people.
Mhm.
And I was just like, "You know what? I'm just gonna send this now because if I wait till tomorrow, I might not send it," and just sent them all, probably like 10 of them,
Yeah.
and it is just, people don't get to hear that
No.
sort of they don't get to receive that enough, and I wasn't expecting a response, but that wasn't the point, but those who responded were just, it hit them at the right time, and it's just like a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
No,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
I remember with one in my case, I had a deputy director at Drug Policy Alliance who was, very good at what he did, but he was also kind of uptight in a way. He was tight, kind of non-emotional. And I remember, and I sent him this letter, and it was just a way of expressing something I don't think he could have heard it to me if I'd said it face to face to
Mm,
him.
mhm. Yeah.
But, or I remember writing another letter to a former lover, who I stayed, friendly with, but was only periodically in contact anymore. But just thinking about her and her mother, who I think, that kind of loving sort of thing. And it's
Mm.
yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could all just do this without drugs, but sometimes when you do it,
Yeah,
and you
right.
remember the other thing about these drugs is that they're teachers, right?
Yeah.
That I think I'm a different person because having done these things. I think they've helped me become
Absolutely.
a more empathic person and somebody who's more connected between my intellect and my heart. I think they've really been useful in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I'm definitely a different, hopefully, I think better person. I think my wife would say I'm a better person. So,
Yeah.
um,
Now, mind you,
uh,
I've never cared much for cocaine, and I used to
mm,
try it occasionally when people offered it. But I can't say that cocaine made me a better person. I think that cocaine's a drug, that when snorted or injected or smoked probably does not bring out the best in people. I think people become
mhm.
a bit, egocentric. I think people become, want to hear, just keep talking and talking and talking, not, and they lose the ability to be a good listener.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's all, and I think also, look, even with psychedelics, people can become, monomaniacal. People can become,
Yes.
I know that when I do a high dose session, um, with a friend or with my romantic partner, it's hard to be present for you have to almost choose to be, to be there's the kind of back and forth can be really difficult, especially on high dose. Lower dose can work, but the higher
Mhm.
dose, I see why it's better to do it on your own, or if you're doing it together with, eye shades and somebody managing the music, or just to go deeper in that level and then be able to connect and bond as you're coming down.
Yeah.
Being attentive
Yeah.
to the setting around these things is really important.
Setting and intention matter.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, and that also, in a way, brings to mind, I was just to, as we're kind of coming down the last 15-10 minutes or so, and I have a couple speed round questions for you, but I just wanted to throw in there. I did appreciate, in your TED talk, which was from, I think, 2014, has like 2 million views now. Very nice. You you said something in the fact, and you can correct whatever I'm saying if it's wrong, but you're like, uh, and for kids, just say no, or don't do drugs. Don't do drugs. But if you do do drugs, make sure you have a way to get home safe, and, that the parent helps you, or, if you're, yeah, have a conversation basically. And, yeah, and I would say also, just as far as what I've read and researched, and I might be wrong here, like there is a sort of a line where people, well, doctors are recommending not to do psychedelics really until 25 or later, once the brain is fully formed. And I don't know if how accurate that is. I certainly know a lot of people who did it before that and they seem fine. But just
Yeah,
putting that out
I
there
mean,
for a range of experience.
I have to say, I mean, the whole thing with developing brain, I mean, there has to be something to it. And we know,
Hmm.
obviously, it's also a matter of degree. I mean, if you're some kid who's waking and baking marijuana, and using
Mm,
it and not using it before classes or whatever, that can't be good. Now, it also turns out that it does not seem to have really, negative long-lasting effects in the vast majority
hmm.
of people. Um, I think with psychedelics, I don't know if the evidence. I mean, obviously, you have to be careful because you need a
Yeah.
certain level of maturity. I'm often, one of the lines I would oftentimes use is that psychedelics are wasted on the young. Right? And I'm oftentimes amazed with young people. I mean, I didn't do it for the first time until I was about 23, 24. Well, I mean, I tried, but not in a where I really had a real psychedelic experience. Um, but it's interesting how many people who do when they're younger describe, "Oh, it was fun," like the water I
Hmm.
was in the swimming and the water was this, or, I was just laughing my head off and it's true. I mean, those drugs can be incredible fun, right? It's also true if you're in an uncomfortable social situation or living with, unprocessed fears and anxieties, it sometimes can really be a very, very, very difficult experience. And there are
Hmm.
people we know who, certainly this was a story back in the 60s, 70s, and undoubtedly still happens. There are people who took a high dose of psychedelics, oftentimes at a young age, and, landed up not being right for weeks or months, and sometimes even forever. I mean, you hear those
Yeah.
stories, and so it's rare, but that, we need to be aware of that side of it. On the other hand, the vast majority of people I know who did psychedelics when they were still in their teens, they're
Hmm.
doing perfectly well these days.
Right.
And some of them, you said, "Okay," I say, "Have you done it recently?" They said, "No, I did it when I was young." And I feel bad for them because they fail to appreciate what a much more
Mhm.
substantial upside can be experienced. But, the other thing, I remember when I did one of my first kinda coming out about my own psychedelic use, and this must have been about 9, maybe 11, 7, something like that, 15 years ago, at a point when people were not really coming out still, and I had to always balance, you know, as a leader of this movement, both with
Right.
cannabis and psychedelics and more broadly, how did I talk about my own use, and when could I take a risk in order to come out publicly? But I remember giving a speech and I'm saying it was at the biennial conference of Drug Policy Alliance. I said, my view is psychedelics are wasted on the young, right? That this is really, and I said, the way I think about it, I said, I'm Jewish, and once a year on Yom Kippur, I do a total fast, 25 hours, no food or water. And I do it
Mhm.
both because of my Jewish identity, but also because I think on some level it's good for the soul. And that kind of altered state you achieve when you've had no food or
Mhm.
water for that length of time, is meaningful. And I see it's kind of the way I feel about psychedelics, that it's something that ideally adults should aim to do at least once a year, as they get older, because we're always evolving. The old line, I
Mhm.
can't remember Ram Dass quote, I don't think he made it, but he quoted from somebody like, when you get the message, hang up the phone. But in point of fact, we'll stop using. But I think because we keep evolving and keep changing with life circumstances and age, that there's always new material there. And to
Yeah.
me, the value of psychedelics, the way I thought about it was it's kind of like, as people get older, right, we make compromises, we age, we have sadnesses or what have you. And there's a sense in which we don't want to stir up emotional stuff that's been settled in us because it's painful. But what the psychedelics can do, the way I'll analogize, is that it's like walking along in a forest in the autumn when the
Mhm.
leaves are on the ground, and you walk along, the leaves are stirring around. But what psychedelics does, it's like you're kicking into it, and you're kicking up not just the surface leaves, but you're kicking up the ones that have begun to compost, and you're kicking up some of the
Mm.
soil beneath it.
Mhm.
You're kicking up that emotional and intellectual and spiritual sediment that can build up in us as we get older. And then I think that kicking that stuff up, stirring that stuff up, even though it can sometimes be a bit scary or what have you,
Mhm.
it's a good thing to do. It's part of a healthy aging process. And so that's why, I'm always encouraging, unless I think a friend is wired in such a way they might have a really, scary experience. I'm always encouraging people to, you know, try these things or to try to make some kind of ritual around it. And, maybe start with the MDMA because it's not really
Yeah.
psychedelic and it's so gentle, and then maybe try ketamine because it's so short acting. And then maybe you
Mhm.
graduate to doing mushrooms at first a lower dose and then a higher dose, or try some of the other ones. Um, I just think these things can be, whether you call them tools or a particular type of fuel,
Mhm.
it's worth doing.
Yes, yes, I completely agree, of course.
Yeah.
And just I also to reflect, like I also have a number of friends who either did it when they were young and didn't quite have the emotional capacity or weren't in a good place to like handle it well and had a bad or dark trip, or are just like afraid now, or like I don't want to like dredge up some emotional stuff or whatever. They would rather just continue on their dysfunctional ways than like
Mhm.
take that deeper look at it, and they're afraid of that, taking that time to take a look at it, which I totally understand. But yeah, just I have a number of friends that similar
Mhm.
experience. But as we're getting down to the end here, I have three sort of speed questions.
Mhm.
The first one always kinda I think you could probably answer it as a speed question. Some people are like, "That's a bigger question." But,
Okay.
so that is, what is an experience you've had recently in an altered state, however that altered state might have been incurred, that has taught you something?
Well, I mean, I think I referenced it briefly before, but literally the mushroom experience I had just a couple days ago.
Mm,
where I focus very intensively on this memoir I'm writing. And writing a memoir is really challenging because you have to go back in
yes, it is.
time. You have to try to remember or imagine what your emotional state was. You have to try to think through, how did I come to this way of thinking? And what it really did was, really help me think more deeply about why I did what I did, and
Mm,
what were the some key emotional moments, and how I need to explain it. Because ultimately, when I'm writing this memoir, no, I mean, I see myself, and I always did, as basically, the line I would use in speaking to audiences is, this drug policy reform movement, we're standing on the shoulders and following the footsteps of other movements for freedom and justice, and the movements for gay rights and civil rights and women's rights and even the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. And in every case, we're fighting against massive, status quo interests and interests grounded in fear and grounded in ignorance, right? And that, so I always saw
right.
my struggle as being of that nature, and yet it's not what our succeed we could not succeed in our cause by framing it in that way. We could win only by framing it in a cost benefit term, or in a racial justice term, or in a disease prevention term, or what have you, right? Or maybe, and so I think what happened in this experience a few days ago was just going that much deeper to some kind of, reformulations and new formulations of 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 trying to turn this book into something that will hopefully not just for people who are already interested in drugs and drug policy, but which might resonate with people more broadly interested in advancing, ways of thinking and being that are grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights, rather than in ignorance, fear, prejudice, and profit.
Science, compassion, health, and human rights. I mean, what could be better,
There you
right?
go. Yeah.
And make more sense.
Yeah.
Well, when that book comes out, we will have to have you back on because
Okay.
I know I will be reading it. Second question. What is something you have lost or experienced around loss in the last few years? And this could be good or bad, that you've learned something from?
Huh. That's a good one. Um, Around loss.
Hmm.
I've been very fortunate in many regards in my life around, not having a lot of human tragedy among the people closest to me. And um you know, I mean, it's a weird one, but it's something recently, it's a financial setback, which, you work
Mm,
your ass off to, I was always never a for-profit guy. I was a not-for-profit guy and invest my money, and then encounter a financial setback that you feel like years of savings may have just, I don't know for sure. And you just learn to breathe and go through it and not obsess about it, and to recognize that you're essentially powerless, and hopefully you learn a lesson. But those types of things, they can keep you up at night. They can eat at you.
very
And just
uncomfortable. Yeah.
realizing that, having lost that, uh, the the more I stressed about it and stayed awake at night thinking about it, it was going to take an additional toll. The financial toll was bad enough. I
Mm,
had to minimize the degree to which it took an emotional toll and a consciousness toll.
brilliant, brilliant, wise words there. Um, yeah. Well, hopefully you're coming out the other
Ho-
side
Hopefully,
then.
we'll see.
Yeah. Last question is, what are you loving right now?
Oh God. I mean, what stands out. There are 3 things, 2 longer term. One is, I am now my daughter, I now have 2
Mm,
grandkids who are like 2 and a quarter and a quarter year
ah,
old,
that is special.
and
Wow.
just the pleasure of that, both seeing my daughter, in a fulfilling marriage and with these 2 beautiful boys, it's just wonderful. The second is, really just falling in love with a really amazing woman. And
Mm,
we're spending more time together than I've ever spent with any other human being in my life, and we just kinda can't get enough of one another. And
ah,
it's just magical. It's really magical. And the third thing, and I'll in a sense, is revealing the day, because you and I are having this conversation the day after the citizens of Hungary a European country,
Ah,
just
yes.
ousted this really terrible fellow, Viktor Orban. And,
Yeah.
I think one thing that oftentimes happens, especially among people on the left, is we don't know how to fully let our victories in, to celebrate them, to own them. I think the right wingers celebrating things I don't really care for or dislike are much better at it. But I think what happened in Hungary was of monumental significance. I mean, it brought tears to my eyes. It is a monumental victory for the values of an open society and for the
Yes.
future of Europe and for what happens in Ukraine and all of this, and not just for what it hopefully portends in terms of what's going to happen with these kind of dark forms of right-wing nationalism and xenophobia, but the fact that even in a country where Orban had really kind of tried to neuter the independent institutions, the
Hmm.
civil society, and the judiciary and the legislature, that this could happen. I really, it would make me feel good if I saw Americans streaming into the streets to celebrate what happened, because it
Yeah.
is monumentally in a world where there's so much bad news. This piece of good news needs to sink in. We need to feel it. We need to feel the sense
Yes.
of identity and empathy, and not just what it means in terms of trying to have hope for what's happening in our own country and other countries around the world, but really it was a spectacular thing that happened for humankind yesterday in
Yes.
this country, and
Yeah.
we need to feel it in our body.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, such a ray of hope. And yeah, I'm getting chills just like thinking about it all. Yeah, everyone celebrate this. And there can be light at the end of the tunnel if we take, continue to
Yeah,
vote and, you know, take the power into our hands. We
yeah.
still
I
have it.
hope everybody listening, the
Yeah.
next time you toast, have a glass of wine or have a toast or whatever, you toast to what happened in Hungary, and
Yeah.
and may this lead the world into a better place.
Absolutely. So here's to Hungary, a toast to Hungary, and thanks you for being on the podcast, Ethan. I loved this conversation. And yeah, be sure. I know you don't necessarily do it all the time anymore, but your whole slew of psychoactive podcasts is worth checking out. A lot of information and great stories there. So thanks again for being on Love, Lost, and Hallucinations.
Okay, Scott, well, as I said, great to meet you last month and really nice to join this conversation. I look forward to next time. Okay,
All right.
take
Thanks, Ethan. If you like this episode, definitely give it a like or a share or follow, a comment, all those fun things. Thanks for tuning in.